July 14, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko. Now we will find out about the situation in our borders and checkpoints. I want to introduce our guest today. It's Andrii Demchenko, the spokesperson of the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. Mr. Andrii, good afternoon. Good afternoon. So, Mr. Andrii, the summer, the middle of summer, it's a vacation period. Can you please tell us how the flow of tourists will influence the overall flow of the people crossing the border? Good afternoon, everybody. Well, first of all, yes, the summer period, the change of dynamics of the passenger flow, it remains dynamic generally, but it has significant increase, which is related to the summer period, because, for example, at the end of the spring, the indicators of border crossing were within 85-90,000 people in both directions, and since the beginning of June, the passenger flow started intensifying, and during weekdays we have around 110-120,000 people crossing the border daily, while during weekends this number may grow up to 130-140,000 people in both directions. But again, those are the figures for the border crossings in both directions, because, for example, in the middle of June there were more people leaving the country because it's the beginning of the season, the beginning of the opportunities to live abroad for vacation, for rest and recreation. After all, the curriculum year was over, plus there was a number of pension age women crossing the border because the men are not yet allowed to cross the border, and we don't observe any growing number of them. Plus, in June the passenger flow intensified 14%, and the vehicles flow intensified 5%. In June, 3.2 million people crossed the border, plus 721,000 vehicles. In July, the passenger flow intensification is not reducing for the time being. Since the beginning of July, 1.7 million people were processed in the checkpoints, including 1.4 Ukrainian citizens, and since the beginning of the year, almost 16.1 million people, including citizens of Ukraine, which are the main category of those crossing the border, plus the foreigners, were registered at the checkpoints. There is intensification in the passenger flow in some checkpoints, which may result in long queues, resulting from a big number of people trying to cross the border. It increases the time for control procedures in both ways. Plus, accumulation of the vehicles may be observed on the Ukrainian side of the border, as well on the checkpoints of the neighboring countries when people are coming back to enter Ukraine. And that's why, for an umpteenth time, we advise the citizens to use the web resources where we post the condition of the checkpoints in terms of the workload. The information is being updated every 3 hours about the situation in the checkpoints on the border with the neighboring countries. And in the same way, our partners also post the same information when there is an intense flow of vehicles, for example, entering Ukraine, so the passengers may pick the checkpoints which are less loaded. Thank you, but do we observe any attempts by the men who tried to leave Ukraine under the martial law? Well, I want to urge everybody to get familiarized with the rules for crossing the border, because on a daily basis about 150 persons, mostly men aged 15 to 60 years, are being refused to cross the border because they don't fall under the category of men allowed to cross the border. However, they come to the checkpoints and they try to prove that they are allowed to. Then they get rejected and they go back. So please get familiarized with the rules of border crossing beforehand, including crossing the border with the children, to avoid such unpleasant situations when people get rejected to cross the border. And unfortunately, we don't observe any reduction of the attempts of illegal crossing the border, and we document such cases both in the checkpoints when people try to use counterfeit documents, specifically in the border with Poland. Well, the passenger flow is one of the biggest in borders with Poland, plus the attempts of illegal crossing the border beyond the checkpoints in the green section of the border are being documented mostly in the border with Romania and Moldova. However, in June, we've observed certain reduction of such attempts, about 28%. But talking about the figures, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion and imposition of restrictions, we identified about 6,000 persons who were trying to cross the border using counterfeit documents, plus we detained about 13,000 citizens, 13,000 men who were trying to illegally cross the border in the green section beyond the checkpoints. Well, and what is the situation in the border with the Russian Federation, specifically in the border with Belgorod region? Well, I cannot segregate any sections of the border with Russia. One thing I want to mention is the situation is quite tense due to intense shelling by the occupiers. They resort to shelling on a daily basis since June last year, when the enemy was pushed out of the Chernihiv and Sumy and part of Kharkiv region, and the enemy keeps intensifying the shelling within the last month. For example, in June, the shellings were twice as intense as in May, and since that time Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv region were shelled by the enemy about 1,000 times, and the most shellings were falling on Sumy and Kharkiv region. Plus the enemy tries to use the unmanned aerial vehicles, including for the purposes of inflicting strikes by dropping explosive devices, and for the purposes of reconnaissance, which are responded by our defense forces, including our state bodyguard service units. For example, only yesterday our units shut down 4 unmanned aerial vehicles used by the enemy. Well, the border with Belarus, what is the situation there? Well, fortunately, the situation in the border with Belarus is under full control. On that side of the border, we don't see any troops that could commit repeated invasion in Ukraine, but unfortunately, Belarus continues supporting Ukraine in the war against Ukraine, and Russia continues using Belarus as a platform or a polygon for training of their troops. Fortunately, the number of Russian military keeps reducing, I mean those who were staying in Belarus and who were involved in training, staying in Belarus polygons. Just recently we were documenting this number at the level of 2,000 personnel, but upon the recent rotation almost all of them were withdrawn from Belarus. However, we still cannot exclude that within yet another rotation and the use of Belarus as a training ground for the troops, more troops can be brought from Russia to Belarus. On top of that, we don't see any significant inflow of the Russian mercenaries from private military companies in Belarus, because we remember that Belarus was preparing grounds for accepting Russian mercenaries. Well, do you observe or do you document any provocations along the border by other Russians or Belarusians? Well, talking about the border with Belarus, we don't see any provocations. As I've mentioned, we continue reinforcing our capabilities in this section of the border, both along the border and in the areas close to the border, so that all the defense and security forces, first of all the units of the State Bodyguard Service who are deployed along the border, plus National Guard and Armed Forces of Ukraine, could be capable of repelling any threat emerging from that axis. The border is being reinforced by engineering installations and anti-tank engineering structures, different type of fences, mines, mine defense lines, and fortifications along the border. Where all of our security forces representatives can fulfill their task in case the threat becomes real. Again, on the other side of the border, the units of the State Bodyguard Service continue tracking the situation there to understand how the situation is changing, to what extent the situation may pose threat to Ukraine. Thank you, dear colleagues. Questions from the floor. Good afternoon. Maria Shenkarenko, Ukrinform. We were talking about illegal crossing of the border, but does the State Bodyguard Service observe any abuse of the Schlag system, and what is the mechanism for punishment for such abuse of the Schlag system? Well, for an umpteenth time, I'm getting back to the rules for crossing the border, and the State Bodyguard Service complies with all the rules regarding all the people who cross the border. We're talking about the martial law. The restriction covers all the men aged 18 to 60 years, but those rules clearly describe the categories of the men who are allowed to cross the border. Well, talking about the Schlag system, it exists for the drivers who live abroad for carrying of passengers or cargo trucks, and sometimes they carry some humanitarian cargo. And unfortunately, last year the State Bodyguard Service documented certain abuses using the Schlag system in both ways, when some licensed individuals or companies who are entitled to add data about individuals to the Schlag system, they add unfaithful information, or when such trip abroad is not related to transportation of cargo or passengers or any humanitarian aid. Again, State Bodyguard Service is not the administrator of the system. We only examine the information, we inspect the information in the system. This information is provided by the licensed authorities, and if the purpose of the trip does not comply with that described in the documents, we refuse such people to cross the border. Only the drivers who perform the international transportation of cargo. We refused about 8,000 of such persons to cross the border since the beginning of the year. For example, the persons are registered as the driver, but on the checkpoint they say they leave for rest and recreation, or otherwise they don't have a driver's license. So I urge everybody not to abuse the system, and in case you try to cross the border in a legit way, you should have all the supplementary documents on you. Thank you very much, Mr. Andrii, for the comprehensive report on the situation on the border. I'm reminding you, joining us was Andrii Demchenko, the spokesperson of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, and Ukraine Media Center. Ukrinform will continue its operation on Monday. We're preparing